I take this opportunity to extend our heartfelt welcome to our most respected chief guest, Dr. Swati Pisha, Associate Professor, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, who is here to share her knowledge on the topic migration and queer sexuality in India. I am sure that the session will be an enriching academic experience to all attending the conference because Dr. Swati Pisha is an excellent academic personality with rich experience in the field. With utmost reverence, I welcome you, ma'am. I also accord our loving and acknowledging welcome to our beloved Professor Sheba teacher, HOD, Department of History of Sri Shankaracharya University, as our moderator. Welcome, dear teacher, to this session. Finally, I would like to welcome all the faculties and students of all the departments to this grand occasion. Welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Naveen. I would now take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Swati Pisha, Associate Professor, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is a researcher, writer, and teacher who works on questions of sexuality, time, gender formation, judicial recognition, and caste capitalism in India. Their first major research project examined sex work, urban informal economies, and labor migration in the city of Mumbai. Their current work explores contemporary queer and transgender social movements in India and their genealogical relationships to the history of India's autonomous New Left, which emerged in the wake of the Indian emergency 1975 to 1977. Dr. Shah is currently works as an associate professor, women, gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Before handing over the mic, I would have to introduce the moderator of the event, Professor Dr. K.M. Sheba, Head of the Department History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi. She is the coordinator of the Dakshayani Velayudan Center for Women Studies. She had contemporary writings on the histories of Kerala. She got MPhil from Jawaharlal Nehru University on some aspects of women's consciousness among Nambudiris in Kerala in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Let me invite Professor Sheba ma'am to lead the section. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Chinju, for that warm welcome and introduction. I would not like to stand between the speaker and the audience. So, Dr. Swati, I'm complete excitement and looking forward to hearing you. Dr. Swati, I invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you all so much. I am very moved by this very warm welcome. Thank you especially to Dr. Sheba for moderating this session, and of course, Dr. Reshma for the wonderful invitation. I hope that my remarks are in some consonance with the discussions that you have already begun today, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you because of the time difference, but I hope that in some way this resonates with some of the other things that you've been speaking about with the wonderful set of speakers that are part of this amazing seminar. What I'm going to do is kind of put together some thoughts from my work, from my older work as well as my newer work. As you heard from the introductions about me, I earlier had done work on sex work and migration in India with a focus on Mumbai. And I'm currently trying to think about how I could contribute to the very robust and complicated discussions that are happening on queer and transgender politics and nationalism in India. Part of that project is a historiographical project, which is why I'm interested in the new social movements that emerged in the late 70s and early 80s. And I'm going to bracket those interests for the sake of my presentation today. Instead, what I'm going to focus on is another kind of part of what I think we need to be thinking about when we think about the convergence of sexuality. And here I'm sort of struggle to think, what do I call it? Sexuality discourses, sexuality politics, sexuality related identities. I'm very aware that most of you are working within the auspices of social work, which in India can be very broadly defined. So I'm going to take full advantage of that broad definition of social work for the purposes of my presentation. But in the US, if I were to be addressing a group of social workers, I would be very much thinking about the categories of identity, the sort of the bodies, so to speak. How do I produce the bodies around a certain set of problematics? Where, for example, might I locate the discussion on lesbian refugees or lesbian migrants in a certain part of the world? In this context, I'm going to focus less on producing the bodies than I am on thinking about the epistemic constraints that render certain identities and certain bodies, so to speak, more legible or more juridically recognizable than others. I hope that this makes sense as I move forward in my presentation. And of course, I invite anyone to stop me at any point with questions or comments. And I certainly look forward to the discussion at the end as well. So where I begin in my work is really in a kind of investigation of sex work as labor migration. This was my first project. And the reason I was interested in labor migration at all is because labor migration in India is, as everyone here knows, a discourse of, among other things, social stratification. It is also a discourse of space. It's a discourse of the economy, the vast space of the economy wherein most people living in India live and survive, which is ostensibly called the informal economy, but it is in fact most of the economy by volume and by population. Within that space, something that I have been trying to apply my work to is the question of how we account for stratification in the space of labor migration in India that also accounts for questions of sexuality. When we try to think through the convergence of sexuality and poverty in general, not just in India, we come across a theoretical problem. And this theoretical problem is that this convergence of sexuality and impoverishment is discursively rendered as oppression, as a lack of agency or a lack in general. Now, while that may be a relevant question, it is not the only question that we can ask here. And in my earlier work, I took great pains to sort of try to move away from this binary of kind of agency and its lack with respect to sex work. And I would make a similar argument in the broader context of thinking about sexuality and impoverishment as well, in that there is a lot more going on than simply a lack of agency when we try to put these terms together. One thing I'm trying to ask is what would happen if we rebelled against this epistemic constraint by looking at this convergence both discursively via questions of legibility and juridical recognition, as well as looking at this convergence ethnographically. So among other things, here what I'm thinking about is the widespread nature of informal economic participation, the fact that not everyone survives in the same way. At the same time, migrant workers in India include queer and trans people, and some of whom are doing sex work, some of whom are doing construction work, domestic work. People are participating in all aspects of the informal economy. I'm also thinking about non-transferable entitlements, things like Aadhaar, as well as Narega, and the ways in which these entitlements are distributed via the rhetoric and discourse of the patriarchal family. It is very difficult to be legible administratively without access to some kind of familial norm, which is usually rendered patrilineally, although this This may be changing to some degree with Aadhaar because every single person in India has to have an Aadhaar card. Nevertheless, there a lot of patrilineal information has to be included in order to even get the Aadhaar card. So I'm not sure that Aadhaar gets us out of that particular constraint. There are some miscellaneous related issues as well for the purposes of my discussion. Again, I sort of talked a little bit about some of the other issues with respect to queer and trans legibility in India, and of course the divergence of queer and trans politics in India is something that other colleagues of mine are talking about in their work. Again, I'm going to bracket that for the purposes of my discussion here. The thing that I'm going to emphasize here is this kind of problem of administrative legibility and the ways in which administrative legibility and its lack serves to render certain internal migrants within India as stateless, because entitlements are conferred via participation in a heteronormative family, but that also because these entitlements are not easily legally transferable. What that means for us, I think, is a kind of the opportunity to ask a certain set of questions around this. First and foremost, for the context of this project, is how we would see people assigned female sex at birth as migrants. In other words, how would we get out of the bind of rendering labor migration via male economic subjectivity? And I'm relying on older feminist economic work in order to kind of bring up this question right at the outset of my presentation. What would it mean to degender economic subjectivity? What would that mean for making a larger group of people identified across gender spectrums legible as labor migrants? There is a larger question here about what a migrant is at all with respect to economic subjectivity and gender and sexuality related identities. And a third question regarding how migration produces space as well as epistemic limits and occlusions. In my work on sex work and sexuality in general, I've been interested, drawing from these questions, in the scholarly interest in sexuality with respect to the academic institutionalization of gender and sexuality studies, and specifically what this has meant for feminist debates on sexual autonomy, including, as I said earlier, debates on sex work and trafficking, which have moved toward a kind of institutional canonization. So here I'm giving the kind of prehistory of my interest in queer and trans politics. Excuse me 1 second, please. I beg your pardon. Now, while it might be premature to say that scholarship on sex work has become an institutionalized academic field in its own right, I think it's fair to say that we have reached a point where scholarly and juridical discourses on sex work and sexuality more broadly have a certain shape and character that bear description and critique in their own right. So one of these kind of the shape that I'm pointing to is the consequence of emphasizing the problematics, aporias, and contradictions created by a focus on the law. While this emphasis has been critical in stalling, if not stopping, the adoption of laws that criminalize people on the basis of sexuality outright, I think this emphasis on the law in studies of sexuality, and here I'm thinking about sex work, but perhaps we can think about 377 as well, are expressed as an emphasis of the juridical poles, on the juridical poles of criminalization, legalization, and decriminalization. While completely necessary and timeless, this focus on the focus on the legal regimes of criminalization, legalization, and decriminalization, at least within studies of sex work, did not result in an engagement with juridicism per se, which, as I've argued elsewhere, would include an interest in how the law is administered, as well as how specific laws are articulated and how certain subjects are rendered legible within those juridical frameworks. I'm thinking here about, for example, critiques of the conflation of trafficking and sex work and the analytic power that we drew from Wendy Brown's mid-1990s book, States of Injury, where she so deftly argued that feminist imaginations of emancipation were critically limited by their focus on injury in the terms of the state, such that feminists ended up reproducing the very configuration and effects of power that they sought to vanquish. The foundational influence of Brown's critiques were clear in critiques of carceral and governance feminism, both of which have been promoted to explain the reliance on criminalization evinced by, in the context of sex work, anti-trafficking feminists as a mode of protecting women. While carceral and governance feminist critiques were generally deployed against efforts to criminalize sex work, these critiques have thus far not resulted in more instrumentalist understandings of the law. If anything, the power of the law was further reified in these critiques via calls for decriminalizing sex work. And again, I hope I'm making it clear that I'm thinking very much about recent juridical debates on how to account for queerness in Indian public discourses, both in the time before the reading down of 377 and afterward. There is an implicit notion here that the law and its practice on the ground are symmetrical, because if the letter of the law results in actual predictive effects, those same effects will be revised if that specific law no longer exists. Decriminalization, that is repealing laws that criminalize people on the basis of sexuality or sex work, would be a good thing, only because it would remove many of the tools that at the state's disposal to maintain the impoverished people are fundamentally criminal. Even as this focus on the law and our research questions has mitigated some of the worst effects of carceral approaches to regulating sex work, this focus has also enhanced the reproduction of occlusions that turn on stable, deracinated social categories like women, men, queer, trans, etc. These occlusions are gendered, they have a sexuality, they are economic, they are racialized, and they are casted. They are gendered in the sense that in the context of sex work, for example, sex work and prostitution remain coded and researched as pertaining to cisgender women as a stable reference of sex work, despite the body of work on men's and trans feminine sex workers. They are economic in that questions of class, landlessness, migration, and the informal economy are subsumed within debates about mitigating the state's juridical harms via its laws. They are racialized and casted in that discourses on sexuality have tended to think both race and caste in relation to poverty almost exclusively, or they have relied on intersectionality to make women, trans people, and queer people, or lower caste people analytically legible via naturalized social categories, while leaving the work of addressing the histories of dispossession that have produced race and caste as social categories to self-styled, in sex work, prostitution abolitionists, or in our kind of queer political context, those who may be focused on the law per se, who may argue that there is little difference between conflating prostitution and trafficking and conflating sexuality and poverty via the trope of a lack of agency. How might we instead account for race or caste within the context of queerness? And again, I'm thinking broadly about the informal economy here, via a different kind of critique, based less on an economy of equivalences and more on a model of history that accounts for how race, caste, and land, for example, produce survival itself as a counter-hegemonic praxis. So one thing that I was thinking about a lot when I was thinking about this with respect to sex work, as I said, was the kind of the ways in which the distinctions between the law and its everyday enforcement are elided, and specifically the ways in which police abuses of the law were included when we had this kind of focus on the juridical categories of the law and how to and how to address those. Policing is either subsumed under the law or more often, at least in the context of sex work, not directly addressed at all. And this was something that was remedied to a certain extent in the run up to the reading down of 377. I do mean to suggest here that we have been unable to countermand some of the marginalization of the nuanced critiques of sexuality and sexual commerce and migration, for example, in rendering certain juridical categories as the hegemonic frames for understanding sexuality. Within those categories, unfortunately, one of the things that we still seem to require pushing back on is the reification of cis-normative gender, both in, for example, hegemonic anti-sex work discourses and in those that are critical of sexuality and poverty, broadly speaking. One thing that I would like to emphasize here is that if, for example, in the category of the migrant, if the economic subject itself is elided within the unmarked universal category of man, and if migrant is also marked as a rational economic agent, then the economic migrant renders the category of migrant female sex worker or migrant women as a discursive impossibility, because anyone who migrates for work who is not cisnormatively male is an impossibility as well. The term migrant can be conflated with freedom or rational economic subjectivity only if irregular and illegal migration are compartmentalized away from migration writ large or reduced to anomalies. What I think this means for thinking about labor migration in India in the post-377 moment includes thinking about the material inequality in India and the way that these are pronounced relative to questions of caste and regional axes. Inequality in South Asia generally has historically engendered robust social movements whose explicit goals include engendering democratic governance and material equality for all, as we all know. The recent limitations placed on the extent to which social movements can operate places potentially greater pressures on survival strategies such as domestic and international labor migration for those whose existence is least secure. So I want to consider now specifically how LGBT juridical legibility impacts survival amongst impoverished queer and transgender labor migrants in India's urban informal economies. The first kind of issue that I would emphasize here is the access to entitlements. Access to entitlements has become extremely fraught for literally everyone, and I'm not suggesting that there's some groups of migrants for whom entitlements are freely available and it's horrible for everyone else. I'm thinking, among other things, about the kind of, as I said, the gendering of the discourse of migration and economic subjectivity. I am thinking, trying to think very carefully about how things like gender and sexuality related identity determine who is legible as an economic migrant at all. In other words, who are we counting when we are thinking with the term migration? I'm also thinking about what this has to do with in which informal sectors, which migrants are legible and which are not. So for example, who is legible within the context of construction work and small scale production, who is legible within sex work, within domestic work, and in which categories of migrant labor are certain categories of workers, such as queer folks who are assigned female sex at birth, in what categories are they legible at all? I'm thinking also here about the telos of caste within this gendering and the presumed status of tribal and Dalit women as compared with more upper caste women living in poverty. In other words, how do we productively bring categorical questions of gender identity, sexuality, and caste into this discussion on migrancy, labor, and inequality in India? The stakes of identity, and therefore the terms of what many of my interlocutors in the context of my project on sex work termed majburi, necessarily include the possibility of domestic statelessness amongst informal sector migrants. All official documents require normative kinship information, including at minimum, father's name, caste, and place of residence, information which is deeply tied to one's kinship networks. Furthermore, while India has a number of economic programs intended to support Indian citizens living below the poverty line, these programs are almost impossible to access as an individual. As we know from the experiences of migrant domestic and construction workers, it is almost impossible to move one's official residence from the village to the city. Although informal sector employment is paid much higher in the city and hence draws thousands of migrants daily across the country, BPL migrants cannot afford housing in a legally sanctioned residential area. Instead, migrant workers must usually opt to live in temporary and illegal settlements throughout the city, if and until those settlements are bulldozed by the municipality to make way for more profitable residential and commercial buildings, as for example is the case in Mumbai's red light districts today. The conditions for domestic statelessness are enhanced by the introduction of Aadhaar, in which attaching fingerprints and retinal scans to a unique numeric term is required for opening a bank account, getting a new phone number, filing taxes, as well as accessing any public entitlement like PDS. Activists, lawyers, and at the time that I wrote this, a retired high court judge had long decried the loss of privacy that the Aadhaar card represents. To this criticism, I might add that biometric identification becomes one more axis for exclusion of migrants, especially those whose kinship networks do not conform to normative forms. And what I'm emphasizing here, and perhaps the thing that's not been sort of explicitly stated so far, is that breaking rules on gender and sexuality related norms also means, for many people, breaking with the normative family. If one does not have access to the juridical legibility of the normative family, this also has consequences for juridical legibility. And I'm thinking about this both discursively and ethnographically, as I said above. When I'm thinking about the discursive space, therefore, of LGBTQI politics in India, I'm thinking about the legibility of a term like hijra and the ways in which, for example, the majority of people who are eligible as hijra are officially defined as OBC by the Indian government as of 2014. While the benefits of caste-based reservations in employment and education accrue to minority of lower caste people, being classified as OBC would offer some means of accessing reserved spots for employment and entitlements that would otherwise be out of reach. However, exclusion from all forms of formal employment and most forms of informal employment has been a feature of LGBTQI existence, especially within certain caste and class contexts. The question of social stratification and inequality, therefore, are foundational to the history of anthropology in South Asia, as well as to the history of queer politics in South Asia. To be sure, a concern within this stratification is not a sum of this history, but I would argue that we have to think about caste and development within the context of this history, much of which this particular conversation has had a culturalist bent and laid the groundwork for a major thread in anthropological research that still persists. Fortunately, and hopefully I'm moving toward this in my presentation, the field seems to be entering a new phase where questions of caste and poverty are no longer sequestered from those of patriarchy, for example, or of queer and transgender politics and existence. One thing that I'm trying to do here is build on a literature that examines how inequality operates dialogically with categories of sexuality and gender that are meant to render people who do not reproduce normative sexuality and gender roles and comportment as knowable. While earlier anthropological work on sexuality and gender in the Global South did historically account for economic stratification and other axes of social hierarchy and marginalization, especially during the worst years of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s, this work was undertaken before the contemporary emergence of globalizing LGBTQI discourses that specifically focused on queer, transgender, and sex worker subjects in the non-Western world. This focus is the result of the visibility of campaigns like the anti-sodomy law campaign in India, but the discourse that organizes knowledge about these campaigns and the people who animate them has increasingly focused on sexuality and gender as bio-ontological truths of the self, as in other words, monological facts of the self that are produced in relation to some underlying chemical or biological propensity or other fact that stems from the biological conditions of one's birth. Another way that I might say this is the discourse on sexuality and gender, and specifically on queer and transness throughout the world, including in South Asia, has tended to focus on biology and not on the social production of these categories. It has tended to render these as the truth of an individual person's being in a kind of non-sociological sense, a non-contextualized sense. So we are kind of rendered with a discourse of sexuality and gender that is deeply depoliticized because it is rendered in terms of a kind of extremely individualized, almost chemical process, and not a process that has anything to do with space, with time, with class, with the law, with any of the kind of juridical, sociological, political tropes that I've been talking about today. This predilection toward biological hardwiring and popular and scholarly understandings of sexuality and gender and their concomitant monological tropes, I think, have had two major consequences for how non-normative sexualities and genders in ostensibly non-Western places have been understood and critiqued within the international rubric of queer studies and queer theory. Within the context of the development discourses that framed work on queer and transgender subjects who were confronting HIV/AIDS in the 90s, queer transgender subjects were often treated as exemplars of categorically extreme forms of marginality and privation. This was not an unwarranted perspective and was supported by additive theories of oppression, which assumed that inhabiting more than one axis of minoritization translated as added degrees of oppression. The second consequence of a monological bias toward sexuality has been in producing an understanding of queer and transgender existence, primarily in relation to the trope of individual freedom of expression, where sexuality and gender identity are thought to be inherent truths of the self, either to be discovered through acts of resistance, self-fashioning, or to be suppressed by normative social forces. The notion that sexuality and gender identity are dialogical, socially mediated, discursive forms of individual comportment would require a frame that moves beyond that of individual freedom and its lack. Using ethnographic work spanning the last decade, I'm thinking about the ways in which sexuality and gender are conveyed and produced via, for example, one's economic class and caste, and propose that one economic space where questions of inequality may be brought to bear on those of gender and sexuality is that of the informal economy. And I'm thinking about this as a physical space, but also as a discursive space. Framing non-normative sexuality and gender in relation to the informal economy allows us to ask how queer and transgender people who exist within conditions of extreme material privation survive, and how and why gender and sexuality could be discursively mobilized in these contexts. The new landscape, for example, of withdrawn or reduced state entitlements for the poor, for example, the ways in which Narega has been unofficially defunded through distributive bottlenecks, has impacted how the legibility of queer or transgender identity operates differently within spaces that are seen to be adjacent to the informal sector, like spaces of sex work and some employment in NGOs. The informal economy is vast, to be sure, and although conventionally identified in the singular, actually covers more than 80%, 90% of all economic activity in South Asia. Keith Hart's 1973 formulation of the informal economy as describing a large class of impoverished sub-proletariats, as he called them, who work outside of the organized labor force, continues to describe that zone of economic activity where the majority of migrant unskilled workers survive. In India, this is the majority of the labor force. Hart's observation about the virtual impossibility of survival. Sorry, excuse me, I just lost my place. For informal sector migrant workers in Ghana in the late 1960s holds true for India's informal sector workers today. His description of the incommensurability between one's earning power and the expenses of everyday life describes the lives of every informal sector worker, not only in India, but all over the world. He wrote in 1973, quote, "The chronic imbalance between income from wage employment and expenditure needs is only partially mitigated by the generosity of kinsmen, neighbors, and only temporarily deferred by manipulation of the credit system," unquote. While drawing on this rich intellectual history is necessary for understanding poverty and sexuality and politics in contemporary India, we are still left with requiring that the term informal sector worker be further elaborated and clarified. This is because nearly all anthropological work on informal economies and migrant workers has a presumed heterosexual and heteronormative bent. This was not entirely unwarranted for two reasons. First, because informal labor contracts in sectors like construction and agricultural work are not infrequently distributed among heterosexual married couples or jodis. This is commensurate with certain tasks in each of these sectors being gendered. For example, in construction work, women are generally hired for quote unquote unskilled labor like moving bricks, while men are hired for quote unquote skilled jobs like plastering and painting. It is not unreasonable to assume that if work is normatively gendered, so too are the workers. Second, while same gender desire and affinal relations have been documented in nearly every place and historical period, same gender desire began to be codified in identitarian terms in the relatively recent past, in the mid to late 19th century. In Foucauldian terms, this codification took place in relation to the romantic ideal of individualism and the social requirements of industrial capitalism. While the discourse of homosexuality has been geographically ubiquitous since the late 19th century, the fact that the homosexual as the concept of a type of person emerged from Europe is significant. In India, the location of homosexuality, including attempts to use the English terms as universal and neutrally descriptive, was used by some to eschew the possibility of Indian homosexuality until the early 2000s, when anti-LGBTQ arguments changed tack and began claiming homosexuality was an urban elite phenomenon rather than being simply foreign. My focus here on the people at the bottom of class and caste hierarchies elicits a focus on the ways in which sexuality and gender-based identity may mediate administrative legibility within biopolitical modes of governance. This may include using an identitarian term to render oneself employable as a peer outreach worker for a non-governmental organization doing HIV/AIDS work, for example. Indeed, in a situation in which sexuality and gender marginality may severely impact juridical legibility, access to citizenship rights, and economic survival itself, to a degree that for some necessitates participating in heterosexual marriage as a way to retain one's legibility, it is reasonable to expect that individuals would deploy whatever modes of legibility they can, including identitarian ones. The social and economic milieu of interest here is the milieu in which NGOs constitute often one of the few stable avenues for formal sector employment, even for a time. Rather than simply being imposed on vulnerable populations, sexuality and gender-based identity in this context may be mobilized in spaces by people seeking to garner better employability. This is not to say that identity is simply taken up inauthentically or that individuals perform identities exclusively as transactional acts. It is to complicate the ways in which decolonialism has become a dominant analytic mode for understanding the spread of Western origin terms for sexuality and gender identity in the Global South. While models for sexuality and gender identity are seen to emerge from the West, are indeed imposed on people in South Asia, for example. I'm thinking about Anirudh Datta's work here via funding priorities and government entitlement schemes. They are also taken up by subaltern subjects as alternate and overlapping modes of self-definition, legibility, recognition, and economic survival. I think I'd like to end by going back to a couple of the questions that I raised right at the beginning. And the main question that I would raise is, when we are thinking about migration in India, who are we counting and where are we locating that discussion? In the presentation that I've offered you today, I have been thinking with the categories of queer and transness, and I have been thinking specifically about the spaces of the informal economy, because this is largely where the migration studies discussion locates its interest. What would happen if we problematized normative sexuality and gender within those spaces? One of the things that I think would happen is we would have to think about administrative legibility, but we would also have to think about the epistemic limits of that legibility, which produce some subjects as more economically viable, so to speak, than others. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. You've raised numerous questions, which I hope will be taken up in the discussions. Now I invite anyone who has a question, a comment, to either speak up or post it in the chat box. I think participants are slowly warming up to asking questions or passing comments. I have a question, Dr. Swati. I mean, how do you look at, the position of the state in this regard? Because ultimately we keep appealing to the state. So, and we also have problems with, the way the state operates. So where would you wish to position yourself within that?
So there are many different, I would say, disciplinary perspectives on that question. Within queer studies, which in the US is very much informed by cultural studies, there has been a move away from engaging with the state. So there has been a move toward, not kind of making the state irrelevant or invisible, but there has been more of an emphasis on questions of affect, questions of aesthetics, as well as questions of ethics that, of course, involve thinking about the state, but kind of moving away from thinking about the state juridically, and certainly moving away from thinking about questions of law and policy. As an anthropologist, I suppose I'm trying to bridge all of those questions. So, and I do not take the view that we should not be engaging with questions of law and policy at all. And I'm very aware that I'm talking to an audience of sex work, of people who are thinking about sex work and queerness in the context of social work, which is very much engaged with questions of law and policy. But I would say that because we are in an academic context, one of the the advantages of that is that we can take a step back and also think about the ways that this engagement with the state produces certain discursive emphases while subsuming others. So one way that I would think about an engagement with the state is to think about the kind of epistemic rubrics or the forms of knowing that it requires. For example, it requires specific identitarian categories that it can act on. If it requires those specific identitarian categories on which it can act, it also engenders those identitarian forms. So, many of us may be having a huge discussion about the fluidity of gender and sexuality related forms, the ways in which sexuality, for example, exists on a continuum. We may be using terms like queer or pansexual to describe certain social forms around sexuality related identity. But if we want certain rights from the state, if we want to assert citizenship rights to the state, we have to make ourselves legible to the state. And I think it's very helpful sometimes to kind of see that as a tactic, a productive tactic, but perhaps not the only way to think about legibility with respect to these categories. One thing that I think your question raises is just, kind of the need to step back and say, what is sexuality and gender at all? Are these things that emerge individually in the body, or are they things that emerge in relation to the world around us? Are they, for example, as Sarah Ahmed says in her book, Living a Feminist Life, are they intensities and possibilities? Is the body a set of possibilities, or is the body a set of determined categories that simply are going to be expressed or not going to be expressed? Specifically, what I think this means for thinking about certain categories of people in the world is, what happens when, for example, we have a growing body of work on queer and trans studies in South Asia, but a lot of that work emphasizes the lived lives of people who were assigned male sex at birth. What does it mean when people who are assigned male sex at birth are extremely legible in a certain discursive or, say, academic context, while people assigned female sex at birth are legible, but perhaps less legible as, say, migrant workers or NGO workers or people who are trying to kind of participate as waged workers in order to be independent economic agents themselves.
Well, thank you, Dr. Swati, for your response. There is a question and a comment in the chat box. Can you read it, or do you want me to read it out, please?
Sure, I don't mind reading it. From Dilip Raj, disciplinary concern. Your mention of the limits of the category of migrant as a rational economic subject was very interesting. Thank you. Does that point towards reinventing the discipline of economics by making it informed by cultural and communitarian elements, go beyond the liberal individualistic imagination of justice? Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that that desire in my paper came across. The political question you are asking, are you suggesting that creating discursive spaces in everyday socialities is more important than focusing exclusively on legal battles? If yes, how far mainstream media is enabling today? I wouldn't say that that creating those discursive spaces in everyday sociality is more important than focusing on the legal battles. I would say that the legal battles happen in the context of wider discursive forces. So I think all of us lived through the last 10 years when the discussion about reading down 377 of essentially decriminalizing homosexuality in India was taking place. And if you recall, that discussion could not have happened without a robust discourse in the media and a kind of normalization of queerness in the media to the degree that it was, so that by the time 377 was read down, it was less a question of if it would be read down than when. And we really saw this difference between 2014, when there was a legal setback at the level of the Supreme Court, and then 2018 when it was finally read down. So again, I think one thing I would emphasize is that the law the law doesn't have a special status in terms of the discursive production of sexuality and gender. It's part of a network and a framework in which these questions are rendered. But I absolutely think that in thinking with sexuality and let's not call it poverty, but materialism more broadly, and thinking about these things together, we have the opportunity to do a lot of things theoretically that would impact things like juridicism. And one of the things we have the opportunity to do is, as you put it in your question, to move beyond liberal individualistic imaginations of justice and of the kind of normative gendered rendering of economic agency. Thank you for those questions and comments, by the way.
Are there other questions coming?
Yes, like I was thinking, like it was a very interesting talk, and I was thinking of the ways in which, you know, like queer people moving, migrations by the queer, trans people, queer people, sex workers are rendered invisible by the discourses on sexuality, whereas there are many queer people from the small villages who move out, who utilize the already existing labor migration networks by the informal, which is by the informal economy. For example, we have people moving out of Kerala to work in the shrimp factories in Gujarat, or in other informal workplaces in Bangalore or Kochi or Chennai, where they also get in touch with the other queer movements that is there in the metro places. But we can say this migratory trajectory is not a, like, you know, labor pathway alone, but it's also like it's also a pathway they follow in while exploring their sexuality, their identity, their politics. But it also brings them in confrontation with other kind of identities. You were mentioning about caste, how the work skills they had back in their villages are not like, you know, it's not, you cannot be utilized in a space in the city, where also the spaces in the city is marked by the caste experiences, by just living in some places in the city, you're already like vulnerable to other kind of humiliations and violence. So these are all these things, all these social markers, all these experiences gets enmeshed together. And as you said, like as academics and also as people who having this politics, like how do we actually and like, you know, not untangle these, because that is not possible, but make visible these kind of entanglements, and how can we actually talk about them, as a question that came through your presentation. And I was also wondering the same thing here in Kerala as well.
I mean, I think that's a wonderful comment. And, you know, here's where I would lean on my disciplinary loyalties to say, I think this is where we need more ethnography, because we cannot rely on the policy frameworks or the legal frameworks alone, because the legal frameworks are being rendered in terms of juridical recognition of the kind of legibility that the state not only defines, but that the state itself desires. So all of this complexity around sexuality and the family, you know, especially the the Indian state as it's being articulated at this point in time, if we look at the kind of complex of laws that are being passed nationally, these laws are really emphasizing patrilineality. They are emphasizing caste. They are emphasizing region. They are not disrupting those divides. If anything, they're reifying them further. So if we were to rely on the kind of more official, more kind of policy-oriented rubrics to render everyday life legible, we would miss a lot. If we also think ethnographically, I think we have the opportunity to kind of not to disentangle these issues, but to think about the way these things operate in a quotidian sense, in the form of everyday life. I think the examples that you raise also bring me back to the question of both kind of the administrative legibility, but also of kind of some of the arguments that Deleuze and Guattari were making in A Thousand Plateaus or in Anti-Oedipus of the kind of patrilineal legibility, so to speak, or illegibility of certain subjects within the context of the heteronormative family form. What happens when one as a kind of individual economic, one has to become an individual economic agent because one is no longer participating in the social reproduction of that heteronormative family form. How do you make yourself legible socially and perhaps, in a very practical way? How do you make yourself legible to the state in that context if you have to apply for an Aadhaar card, but you have no formal residence because your formal residence is tied to a patrilineal family unit that you are no longer participating in the social reproduction of. So I think this is where ethnography is not just a kind of esoteric academic framework that helps people like me write papers in obscure academic journals, but we can actually bring out the complexity of these stories in a way that accounts for some of the ways that people, they're not just the victims of this illegibility. They navigate and negotiate it. They make other social networks. They access other ways of kind of waging their own economic survival, but also kind of waging communities, waging networks as well.
Like if anybody want to ask questions, they can also ask in Malayalam. Now we are ready to translate it into English.
May I ask, are most people here, are most people students or?
There are most of the people here are students, but there are also a few others like the Dilip Raj who asked the question. He is a professor in philosophy department in another college, and there are my colleagues, teachers, faculty members. So it's a mix. There are also some research scholars here. We're also working on areas of sexuality, gender.
But yes, if anyone has a question, I'm sorry I don't understand Malayalam, but please, I would love to hear your thoughts.
We don't see questions coming in. Reshma?
Yeah, like So we will ask one more time, and
Is there anyone who wants to post a question or comment in Malayalam, English, Hindi? Language. It's possible. Language should not be a barrier at all. If
you
you
can also write in the chat box.
Yes, if your audio is a problem, you can even type in the chat box. Is there anyone? Any questions? Then I guess that's all.
Well, if we have a little bit of time, may I ask something?
Yes.
Sure, please do.
So this seminar, was the impetus for the seminar related to certain specific events that are happening in Kerala, or was it instigated by other kind of a certain set of events? Or I'd just love to know some of the background of how this came about.
Actually, it's not related to any particular event, but you can say this is a culmination of a lot of dialogues that was happening within the department, and also with the alumni who were moving out. As you know, many of the social workers, once they graduate from India, they also move to other parts of the world where they work.
Yes.
And their experiences and their sharing, and many of them themselves have been migrants, and also social workers are working with the refugees and these identities. And in many, or during our own work also, we have to confront how social workers assume certain fixed identity category and work with it, because we also work with the templates that is internationally circulated. So you have a
Yes.
poverty eradication template which might be originating in Bangladesh, and then
Right.
it is uploaded by the UN, and then that becomes projects in almost all the southern
Right.
and we work in the. And at some point of time, there's also a sense of disquiet, and sense of futility thing, and also the people with whom we are working also start questioning us back. So it has been a dialogue that has been happening, and individually maybe people were dealing with it and talking about it, but social work, I think the social work as a discipline is very reluctant to write and theorize about our own experiences, unlike anthropology or history. So all those things led to discussions, debates, and then finally and at least we want to open up these discussions to a larger place where we're also thinking of publishing the debates in the webinar, so we can take it further. It is not kind of secluded within our university, so it's certainly try to include into the discourse, and I don't know whether that will be
that sounds wonderful. And of course, I'm here because I agree with this this goal. And as we interacted a little bit on email about the impetus for this seminar, if I could say, I'm just sort of discerning, what it's like for people who are kind of being trained to be social workers, or trained to engage with the kind of policy debates and discussions that you just alluded to think theoretically. And one of the reasons that I'm sort of interested in ethnography is because it really shows that human beings have to theorize in order to live. There is no sort of abstract group of theorists sitting in Europe deciding what theory is, and then everybody else sort of follows along. people have to abstract from their own individual experience in order to live in the world, because human beings are a fundamentally social species. Like all living things are fundamentally social. No living thing can exist in isolation and in a kind of atomized way. So even though it may seem a little bit esoteric at times to step back and say, well, you know, what is migration, and what do we actually mean when we say queer, when we say migrant? I think particularly for people who are trying to make sense of the policy discussion around these things, when, you know, suddenly within a generation, a whole new category of human existence has become legible within a certain policy context. I mean, 10 years ago, there was no such thing as a queer refugee at all. And now there are apparently queer refugees everywhere. That is something that I think people who are trying to intervene in policy discussions should be aware of those histories and aware of what it means to render certain people legible as, you know, for example, drawing on the presentation I just gave, what does it mean to talk about queer people in the informal economy? That phrase, queer people in the informal economy, could not have been said 10 years ago. That doesn't mean that suddenly there's a bunch of queer people in the informal economy and there were no queer people there before. It means that the lens has shifted. And when the lens shifts, it gives certain gifts, it has certain benefits, and it also has, there's certain sacrifices that have to be made within, in order to render that kind of legibility. And I can't think of a group of people better equipped to theorize that than social workers who are dealing with these questions. So I'm just so glad that you're having this conversation in this context.
Yes, we had quite very interesting discussions throughout, because like, for example, in the morning, like what you said, like how a category called MSM suddenly become
Yes.
very entrenched in this AIDS prevention work by the government around for quite some time, like 10 to 15 years, and then suddenly this category vanished altogether
Right.
from the, and also how poverty, like, you know, the journals, academic journals which write and think and theorize about poverty, 90% of these writers and editors are from the global north, whereas global south always remains as the case study.
Yes.
Their
Yes.
voices are never heard. So all these things like are coming through during the debate
Yes.
discussions.
That's so helpful. The way I am having that conversation is thinking about this binary between episteme and exemplar, where the episteme, you know, the kind of the rubric for knowing, comes from Europe, from the Euro-American academic theory, and then the exemplar, the examples of that theory, come from the global south or from South Asia. And you all know that's not true, because, you know, there are many, we all rely on people doing theory in the academic context in South Asia. But I would kind of take that a few steps further to say, as I said, in order to live as a human being, you have to be a theorist. And the job of an ethnographer is to articulate that the way that the people that you're talking to are theorizing their everyday lives. And I can't think of a group of people better positioned to do that than people working in the policy world. I'll just tell you a short vignette about that category MSM if we have time. When I was doing my earlier field work on sex work, and initially I was going around to all these NGOs, and I was trying to intervene in the discourse on trafficking. And, you know, I was annoyed that sex work in India was being reduced to trafficking when, you know, it was obvious that people were just kind of trying to negotiate livelihoods and live their lives. And internationally, the conflation or the equating sex work and trafficking was starting to gain a lot of traction. So I thought, you know, I'm very smart. I'll go to India and I'll find the migrant sex workers, and that'll fix everything. So I came to India and I started looking for NGOs that would introduce me to migrant sex workers. And that was not a legible category. The only way that sex workers were legible at that time was as recipients of HIV/AIDS related services. The discourse on trafficking had still not gained hold in India the way it did later on. This is like late 90s, early 2000s. So I ended up visiting a lot of HIV related NGOs. And one of them in Gujarat had a very strong MSM program. And as you know from your earlier discussions, MSM means men who have sex with men. And it was supposed to be a term that bypassed the Western identitarian categories of gay, right? You know, that men may not identify as gay, cis men may not identify as gay, but they have sex with men. So, you know, I very naively, being a queer person who was raised in the US, thought, you know, this is like a descriptive way to talk about men who have sex with men. This is not an identity. So I go to this NGO and I meet the people who are running the MSM program. And at one point, this guy says, and so that's why we identify as MSM. And I thought, and I just spoke back. I didn't even think what I was saying. And I said, but MSM is not an identity. And he became very angry with me. And he said, you cannot deny us our identity. We are MSM. We identify as MSM. You cannot take that away from us. And it was just this moment where, you know, he was seeing this kind of young American Indian queer person saying, you do not have a right to this identity. But I was coming from a context where MSM is not an identity. It's a descriptive term that's meant to get people out of that box of identity. And it was very awkward, but a very important lesson for me that when these categories travel, you never know what's going to happen. They grow legs, so to speak. And in this context, MSM had become an identity. They were identifying as MSM. They did not identify as gay. And if I said that this was not an identity, I was the one being problematic because I was imposing yet another framework from somewhere else and didn't understand that this had its own life in this very local context in Gujarat.
Like also all these identity categories which come and go and get, you know, entangled with other categories, they might also have left their own archives within the, you know, places, the roots of their migration, the places of their migration, even on their bodies. Like, for example, I was thinking of all the gender reaffirmation processes that is happening, and the body itself becomes the archive in
Yes.
those. And not just the body, as you said, the spaces, the urban spaces, the slums, maybe the margins, other locations, workplaces, all these. So it would be interesting to have, you know, like search for archives in places even in far cut, you know, roadsides and kind of thing.
Absolutely. Definitely.
It was a joy, it was a pleasure, and intellectually stimulating to speak with you. Hope we can keep up this, connection and have further dialogues further on.
It was a joy for me too. Thank you so much. And I wish everyone well in your studies and your research and of course in your seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Shiva,
Thank you, Dr. Swati, for that
Thank you.
time. and spending so much time in discussion as well. Dr. Reshma, is there somebody to propose a vote of thanks?
Yeah, of course there is.
Okay.
Hello, we can go to the vote of thanks now.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful talk, and it was nice to hear from you. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Revati V to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, all. I deem it a great honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on this special occasion. The first and foremost, I thank our special guest, Dr. Swati Shah, Associate Professor from University of Massachusetts, Amherst, who despite her busy schedule has found time to grace this event. My heartfelt gratitude to Professor Dr. K.M. Shiba, Head Department of History from Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, for her valuable contribution as a moderator. I owe special thanks to Dr. Reshma Bharadwaj and other faculties who have worked hard to ensure that this occasion becomes a memorable success, and for their guidance and encouragement. Finally, I thank all the invitees and audience present here with attention and cooperation in making event resounding success. To conclude, let me once again reiterate my gratitude to all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good morning to you, Swati. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening to you all.
Bye, Swati. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.